Welcome to the first part of our comprehensive lecture series on anthropological theories. Today, we are going to lay the foundational groundwork for understanding how social sciences, and anthropology in particular, make sense of the human experience. We will skip past our preliminary study instructions and dive straight into our first major conceptual question. What exactly is a theory? Let us start with a general definition. A theory is a broad statement trying to explain a series of phenomena. It is not a narrow explanation of just one isolated event, but a wide-ranging framework that can be applied to many different situations. Think of an analogy from physics, Newton's 3 laws of motion. Those 3 laws alone can explain the behavior of any moving object, whether it's a ball thrown in a curved path, a car driving in a straight line, or an object bouncing off a wall. In the social sciences, a theory serves the exact same purpose, one general statement that can explain numerous diverse social phenomena. Now, it is crucial to distinguish between theories and laws. In the natural sciences, we deal with laws. Laws are proven through rigorous testing and experimentation. They have verifiable proof and apply universally without exception. Theories in the social sciences, however, are quite different. They are more or less opinion-based. When a social scientist proposes a theory, they are essentially saying, I think this is the reason behind this social phenomenon. Because human behavior is complex, there is no absolute compulsion of mathematical proof. Theories represent human opinions and intellectual interpretations, meaning you are entirely free to agree or disagree with them. So, how do we build a theory? It requires 4 major elements. The first element is the question, which arises from a gap of knowledge. This is when you observe something happening in society but do not yet understand why. You notice 2 phenomena and want to know the causal relationship between them. For example, a researcher in India might observe that as urbanization rises, joint families are disintegrating and nuclear families are becoming the norm. The gap of knowledge is the how, or why. What is the causal mechanism linking urbanization to the breakdown of the joint family? Once you have your question, you move to the second element, which involves 2 steps, assumptions and hypotheses. An assumption is your intuitive hunch. It is a broad, untested belief about what might be causing the phenomenon. In our urbanization example, your assumption might be that economic changes are driving this shift. From that broad assumption, you formulate a hypothesis. A hypothesis is a precise, testable statement derived from your hunch. It specifically proposes how economic factors dictate the breakdown of joint families, setting you up for the next step of research. The third element is methods. Once you have a testable hypothesis, you need a way to figure out if it is actually valid. Does the real-world evidence support what you have proposed? To find out, you must develop specific methods to gather data. You might check if the disintegration of joint families happens in all urban areas of India, or perhaps globally. To collect this data, researchers use methods like conducting direct interviews, analyzing census surveys, and taking statistical samples. The fourth and final element is evidences. This is the data you gathered using your methods. Now, you look at the evidence to see if it supports or rejects your hypothesis. If the data aligns with your proposition, congratulations, your hypothesis is elevated to the status of a theory. If the evidence does not support it, you don't just give up. You reject that hypothesis, formulate a new one, and start the testing cycle over again. This iterative cycle is the engine of all social science research. To truly understand anthropological theories, we must look at the history of anthropology itself. All humanistic subjects, anthropology, sociology, psychology, history, have their origins in the era of Enlightenment in Europe. To understand this, we look at a specific historical timeline, the 14th and 15th centuries, known as the era of Renaissance, followed by the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, the era of Enlightenment. But to understand why these eras were so transformative, we first need to look at what Europe was like before the Renaissance. The story of anthropology's origins actually begins much earlier, in ancient Greek civilization. From the European perspective, this was one of the most developed and intellectually rich civilizations in history. It produced intellectual luminaries whose ideas still shape our world today. Socrates, his student Plato, Plato's student Aristotle, and Aristotle's famous student Alexander the Great, who would go on to conquer much of the known world. The political system of ancient Greece was a classical democracy, or republican state, but it was very different from modern democracy. Today, we vote in elections. In classical Greece, political power was accumulated based on the sheer number of followers you had. To get followers, ambitious men would accumulate massive wealth through trade or force. They would then stand on a podium and literally give that wealth away to the public in what was called a redistribution ceremony. If you promised $10,000 to anyone who supported you, you gained followers, and through them, you gained political power. This Greek civilization prospered heavily through extensive trade with neighboring regions. The merchants used this immense wealth to construct grand stadiums, temples, and public gathering places. These spaces became the social hubs of the era. The dominant males of society would gather there to discuss everything from local gossip, like someone eloping or preparing for exams, to tales from distant lands brought back by traders. These public spaces essentially became the world's first incubators for social observation and debate. During this time of vibrant exchange, a trader and traveler, often identified historically as Herodotus, came into contact with dozens of different nationalities. Every time he met people who lived differently from the Greeks, he asked a fundamental question. How are they related to us? Are they similar or are they different? This sparked a massive debate in the stadiums, dividing thinkers into two camps. The Universalists focused on what humans shared, pointing out that all cultures have families, marriages, and gods. The relativists, on the other hand, focused on what made cultures unique, highlighting different modes of worship, unusual rituals, and the practice of magic. The Greek trade network was massive, stretching from Gibraltar to Persia, which inevitably led to cultural conflicts. A great example of this is the origin of the word barbaric. When the Greeks encountered the Persians, they tried to communicate but could make absolutely no sense of the Persian language. To the Greek ear, the Persians just sounded like they were repeating the same nonsensical sounds over and over. Bar, bar, bar. Because of this simple linguistic incomprehension, the Greeks labeled the Persians as barbaric, a term that obviously took on a much heavier meaning in history. Moving forward, we must look at Aristotle, often considered the father of anthropology. In Aristotle's time, the absolute dominant worldview was creationism. There was no concept of evolution. People believed God created the earth and all living things in a single event, exactly as they are. Within this framework, Aristotle developed his hierarchy of beings. He ranked all creation, placing inanimate objects at the bottom, then plants, then animals, and finally humans at the very top as God's most superior creation. Why did Aristotle place humans at the top? Because he argued humans alone possess rationality, the capacity to reason, feel complex emotions, and hold moral values. Late in his life, he made a fascinating paradoxical observation. Man is the only animal that can be simultaneously moral and immoral. A tiger killing its prey isn't being evil, it is just operating on pure instinct. There is no virtue or vice in nature, but humans have the capacity for reason, which gives us the choice to be moral. And tragically, because we have that exact same choice, we are also the only creatures that can actively choose to be immoral. Aristotle gave us two vital Latin formulations. The first is zoon politikon, meaning man is a political animal. Now, politics here doesn't just mean voting. Politics is defined as the unequal distribution of power among a group of people living together. Whether that power is distributed by brute force, modern elections, or competitive exams like the UPSC, some mechanism always decides who holds power. Aristotle recognized that wherever humans live together, there will necessarily be a mechanism for distributing power. Politics is an unescapable byproduct of human society. His second formulation was zoon logon econ, meaning man is a rational or logical animal, driven fundamentally by reason. This was an incredibly profound insight for the 4th century BC. Aristotle was arguing that human behavior could be understood through logic, an idea that was vastly ahead of its time. In fact, this specific concept wouldn't become the intellectual mainstream until the Enlightenment, more than 2,000 years later. Aristotle's student Alexander the Great absorbed this entire intellectual framework. As he set out to conquer the known world, largely the Eurasian region, he didn't just bring armies, he brought culture. After conquering a territory, Alexander actively spread Greek culture. This cultural diffusion is why we see Greco-Roman art, paintings, and architecture spread across vast distances, eventually reaching as far as India along the trade routes that Alexander's campaigns opened up. After Alexander, the Greek Empire eventually fell, making way for the rise of the Roman Empire around the 2nd to 3rd century BC. The Roman Empire became the massive vehicle for the global spread of Christianity. After the death of Christ, his disciples traveled the world. A significant historical detail for India is that the Apostle St. Thomas arrived in India in the 1st century AD. Because of this, India actually has one of the oldest Christian populations in the world, older than many parts of Europe. The Syro-Malabar Christians trace their origins to these earliest conversions. When the Roman Empire disintegrated in the 4th century AD, Europe shattered into numerous small, fragmented ethnic states: the Slavs, Celts, Germanic peoples, and Britons. But despite this political fragmentation, one institution maintained absolute authority across the continent: the Christian Church. Because there were no massive, powerful states left, the Church filled the power vacuum. Just as priests in ancient India or Muslim clerics would legitimize kings by declaring them divine representatives, the Church in Europe decided which kings were legitimate. Consequently, the Church controlled politics, economics, and, most importantly, all forms of knowledge and education. This absolute church authority held until the late 15th century, when the mercantilist economy began to rise. Wealthy traders started funding massive navigation expeditions. Why? Because the Ottoman Empire controlled the overland trade routes to India, making trade incredibly difficult for Europeans. They desperately needed a sea route. This kicked off the Age of Discovery. Christopher Columbus sailed in 1492 looking for India, but landed in the Americas, mistakenly calling the indigenous people Red Indians. It was a cartographer named Amerigo Vespucci who realized it was a new continent, mapped it, and had it named America after himself. The Age of Discovery had two massive consequences. First, explorers started writing travelogues, essentially the 15th century version of travelogues. Second, the dissemination of these travelogues was supercharged by the invention of the printing press around 1448. Before this, books were copied by hand. The printing press allowed ideas to literally go viral. However, to sell books, these travelogues relied heavily on sensationalism. Just like modern YouTube clickbait, explorers wouldn't just say people over there live like us. They would claim that people had 3 hands or 2 mouths, prioritizing captivating stories over the actual truth. Beyond sensationalism, these travelogues were deeply embedded with Christian prejudices. Take Amerigo Vespucci's writings about Native Americans. He described them as promiscuous, lacking morality, and living like animals without laws or countries. This wasn't just bad observation, it had a political purpose. By framing indigenous peoples as lawless savages, Vespucci and others argued that they required control by an absolutist monarch or papal power. This narrative brilliantly justified European colonization, framing it not as a brutal conquest, but as a necessary, civilizing intervention for people who supposedly couldn't govern themselves. But here is the great paradox. While these travelogues justified church power abroad, the discoveries themselves destroyed the church's authority at home. The Bible was the ultimate encyclopedia of knowledge, but it described a flat earth limited to parts of Europe and Asia. Then Magellan circumnavigated the globe, proving the earth was round. Explorers found America, Australia, and massive parts of Africa, none of which were mentioned in the Bible. People began to ask a dangerous question. If the Bible didn't know about America or that the earth was round, how could we trust anything else written in it? This crisis of credibility triggered the transition into the Enlightenment. This brings us to the era of Enlightenment, defined by 3 core ideas. The first is the rise of rationalism. If the Bible could no longer be taken on blind faith, society needed a new foundation for knowledge: proof, observation, and testing. People demanded to know the cause and effect relationships of the world. In the medieval era, if you asked why an apple falls, the church would say, because God wants you to eat it. In the Enlightenment, that answer was no longer acceptable. Reason demanded a demonstrable physical cause, which eventually led thinkers like Newton to formulate the laws of gravity. The second core idea is human progress. The Enlightenment was an explosion of scientific discovery: physics, chemistry, math, and agricultural innovations. For the first time in European history, societies produced a consistent surplus of food, finally escaping the medieval dark ages of constant famines and plagues. Because this massive improvement in daily life was directly caused by science, Enlightenment thinkers adopted a deeply optimistic worldview. They believed that human progress was inevitable, and that moving forward, science would eventually solve all of humanity's problems. Building directly on progress is the third idea: the perfectibility of human nature. Thinkers propose that this scientific trajectory would ultimately lead humanity to a state of absolute perfection, a world where everyone is healthy, wealthy, totally free, and rational. Notice how radically this challenges the old religious worldview. Creationism implies a static world. God made us this way, and we will always be this way. The Enlightenment introduced a dynamic worldview. We were not the same centuries ago. We are better now, and we will be perfect in the future. Human fate was now in human hands. As natural scientists discovered the laws governing the physical world, philosophers started asking a revolutionary question. If there are strict laws governing gravity and chemistry, shouldn't there be laws governing human social life? They realized that institutions like family, marriage, and religion weren't created by God. They were created by humans, and human creations should follow discoverable rules. This intellectual project, finding the laws of social life, gave birth to the social sciences: psychology for the mind, sociology for industrial society, and anthropology to understand the diverse peoples of the world. This practice of borrowing natural science principles to study society has a specific name: positivism. Positivism is a theoretical approach that advocates applying the strict methods of natural sciences, like observation, experimentation, and empirical verification, to social phenomena. Just as Newton gave us the general laws of motion, positivist social scientists sought to uncover the general, unbreakable laws of human behavior, family, and religion, relying entirely on collected data rather than philosophy or theology. Let's look at positivism in action, using our earlier example of urbanization and family structure. A positivist would look at the data and propose a general law. Industrialization requires labor mobility. If you are a mechanical engineer, you have to move to where the factories are: Pune, Manasar, wherever the job is. You cannot practically relocate a joint family of 20 people every time you change jobs. Therefore, industrialization structurally forces the creation of nuclear families. We see this today with IAS officers who face frequent transfers. Maintaining a joint family on the move is impossible, making the nuclear family a practical necessity. Before anthropology formally began, several early thinkers laid the groundwork for social progress theories. The first was Italian scholar G.M. Battista Vico. He proposed that societies pass through three distinct ages. First, the age of God, where everything is attributed to divine will and humans have no agency. Second, the age of heroes, where powerful individuals rule by claiming to be messengers of God. Finally, the age of man, where society is governed by reason and rationality. Crucially, Vico warned that this progress is circular, not just a straight line. If a massive catastrophe destroyed civilization, humanity would regress right back to the age of God. Vico also introduced a brilliant concept called sapienza poetica, or poetic wisdom. He argued that early humans didn't communicate in direct scientific terms. They used metaphors and mythologies. A perfect example is how British scholars misread the Rig Veda. The text mentions Purandar, the destroyer of fortresses, destroying cities. Scholars took this literally and invented the Aryan invasion theory to explain the fall of the Harappan civilization. But Vico would point out that Purandar was a metaphor for devastating natural forces, like heavy rainfall, not a literal historical army. Failing to understand poetic wisdom leads to massive historical misinterpretations. The second precursor is Montesquieu, famous for his political theory of separation of powers. Montesquieu proposed that all societies universally pass through three exact stages of development. First is savagery, a lawless stage where people survive purely by hunting and gathering. Next is barbarism, where people settle down and invent subsistence agriculture, living hand to mouth. Finally, civilization, where advanced agriculture creates a surplus of wealth. That wealth builds cities, and cities require institutions like tax collectors, legal systems, and kings. Montesquieu believed every society on Earth would independently walk this exact path. The third precursor is Auguste Comte, the father of sociology. He focused on intellectual development, proposing three stages. First, the theological stage, where people believe a benevolent God controls absolutely everything. But as society experiences innocent suffering, like war or crime, they move to the metaphysical stage. Here, they still believe in supernatural powers, but question if those powers are actually benevolent. Finally, society reaches the positive or scientific stage, where supernatural explanations are abandoned entirely, and phenomena like earthquakes or plagues are explained purely through natural science and reason. All these ideas of progress culminated in the first formal theory in anthropology, classical evolutionism. This theory emerged during the era of colonization, as Europeans encountered indigenous tribes in Africa, Australia, and the Americas. Viewing themselves as the pinnacle of scientific progress, Europeans had to explain who these people were. They made a massive theoretical leap. They interpreted spatial difference as temporal difference. They believed these tribes weren't just living differently in a different place. They were literally living in the past. Looking at an indigenous tribe was to the European mind like time traveling back to see what Europe looked like thousands of years ago. The core proposition of classical evolutionism is that human society experiences successive, progressive development in sequences. The present developed stage of mankind arrived here through unilinear evolution. Unilinear means moving in one direction only, forward, never backward, just like a student progressing from kindergarten through 12th grade. The evolutionist claimed that every single culture on Earth, regardless of where they are, must pass through the exact same sequence of stages: savagery, then barbarism, and finally civilization. This evolution follows three specific directional trends. The first is the movement from simple to complex. In a simple hunter-gatherer band, life is undifferentiated. If the group decides to move to find water, that one action is their politics, their economics, and their family life all rolled into one. But as society evolves, it becomes complex. Institutions separate and specialize. We build parliaments for politics, central banks for economics, and universities for education, completely separating these functions from basic family life. The second trend is from homogeneity to heterogeneity. In early societies, everyone is homogeneous. They are alike. They speak the same language, wear similar clothes, and have the exact same skills. Everyone is a hunter or a gatherer. But evolved societies are highly heterogeneous. People have radically different skills. Some are doctors, others are engineers or artists. They speak different languages and live different lifestyles. The ultimate endpoint of this heterogeneity is modern individualism, where every single person develops a completely distinct personality and worldview. The third trend is from indefinite to definite. Early societies handle crises indefinitely, relying on random trial and error because they lack accumulated knowledge. Evolved societies operate on definite, established procedures. A perfect example is the COVID-19 pandemic. Because of centuries of accumulated scientific knowledge, humanity had a definite response. We immediately sequenced the genome, created rapid tests, and developed a vaccine in record time. Compare that to centuries ago, where a new disease, like the measles brought to the Aztec civilization, would simply wipe out the population because there was no definite medical procedure to fight it. But this raises a massive logical question. If societies across the world had no contact with each other, how did they all independently invent the same stages of savagery, barbarism, and civilization? The evolutionists answered this with the psychic unity of mankind. This concept states that the human cognitive architecture is fundamentally the same everywhere. When human minds face the same problem, they independently invent the same solution. Think of school students. All over the world, when the syllabus gets too hard around 7th grade, students independently invent the exact same methods for cheating, writing on palms or hiding notes in pens. That parallel invention happens because human minds think alike under similar pressures. To prove that this evolution actually happened, theorists propose the doctrine of survivals. Survivals are cultural practices that are carried on purely out of habit, even though they have lost their original function. Take the handshake. It originated in ancient times for military leaders to prove they weren't holding a weapon. Today, you aren't worried your friend is going to stab you, but you still shake hands out of cultural habit. Another example is our hesitation to use curse words in formal settings, which survives from ancient beliefs in sorcery, the fear that spoken words had magical power to cause real harm. Just like the appendix in our bodies, these vestigial cultural habits prove that society has evolved from an earlier stage. Let's summarize the core tenets of classical evolutionism for your notes. First, social development experiences successive progressive development, moving from simple to complex, homogeneous to heterogeneous, and indefinite to definite. Second, every culture universally passes through the unilinear stages of savagery, barbarism, and civilization. Third, this universal similarity is caused by parallel invention, which is driven by the psychic unity of mankind. And finally, the proof that this evolution occurred is found in survivals, practices maintained by force of habit that no longer serve their original purpose. Now, we must be explicit. This theory did not develop in a political vacuum. It emerged during the height of European colonialism and served to perfectly justify it. European nations were preaching liberty and equality at home while brutally colonizing Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Classical evolutionism resolved this moral contradiction. By ranking societies based on scientific knowledge, Europeans placed themselves at the top and classified indigenous peoples as savages or barbarians. This allowed them to frame colonization not as violent exploitation, but as a moral duty, the white man's burden, to civilize the world. In India, the British used this exact framework, labeling the agrarian society as barbaric and tribal groups as savage to justify ruling Indians as subjects in their own land. Understanding this historical, intellectual, and political context is absolutely essential because it sets the stage for the specific theories that built the discipline of anthropology. The framework of classical evolutionism was championed by three major scholars who are central to our syllabus: E.B. Tylor, L.H. Morgan, and James George Frazer. Having established why and how their worldview was formed, we are now perfectly positioned to dive deeply into the specific contributions, stages, and theories proposed by each of these three foundational figures. Let's pick right back up with our discussion of classical evolutionism and look at its first major scholar, Edward Burnett Tylor. He is widely regarded as the founding father of anthropology. In fact, his work was so central to the early discipline that the German scholar Max Müller famously referred to anthropology itself as Tylor's science. This shows just how much Tylor single-handedly shaped what would become a formal academic discipline. When he published his landmark work, Primitive Culture, anthropology was still in its infancy, and his comprehensive treatment gave the field both a name and a scientific identity. Also, a quick but crucial factual note for your exams. His name is spelled Tylor. Do not make the common mistake of spelling it Taylor, as some popular prep books do. Tylor was born in Britain into a Quaker family. The Quakers were a relatively well-off community, but they were a religious minority in a predominantly Protestant and Catholic society, which led to their social marginalization. When Tylor finished his early schooling, he applied to Oxford University, one of the most prestigious institutions in the world. However, Oxford had a strict policy of admitting only Catholic Christians at the time. Tylor was categorically denied admission purely because of his Quaker identity. This blatant religious discrimination had a profound effect on him. He developed a stance of agnosticism, not outright atheism, but a deep questioning. He began to wonder if religion was truly a divine institution or simply a human invention used to perpetrate injustice. Unable to attend Oxford, Tylor completed his graduation at colleges within his own Quaker community. Around the age of 20 to 22, he developed symptoms of tuberculosis. Back then, the standard medical advice for TB was to travel to warmer climates, so Tylor headed to Cuba to recuperate. While holidaying there, he met a man named Henry Christie. Christie was a wealthy traveler and businessman who engaged in informal archaeological excavations, which at the time was more like treasure hunting for rare artifacts and gold coins than the rigorous science we know today. The two struck up a friendship that would change the course of Tylor's life. Tylor and Christie decided to travel together to Mexico to excavate multiple sites. But while he was there, it wasn't the ancient artifacts that captivated Tylor, it was the living people. Mexico had numerous tribal communities living in the jungles, and Tylor observed their way of life closely. He was struck by a massive puzzle. The practices, beliefs, and cultural features of these Mexican tribes were remarkably similar to things he had read about in travelogues from Asia, Africa, and Australia. How could people in remote Mexican jungles share cultural features with people across the globe when they had absolutely no contact with one another? He began documenting his observations in a descriptive travelogue titled Anahuac. After returning to Britain, Tylor immersed himself in a systematic comparative reading of accounts written by travelers, missionaries, and diplomats. He consistently found that cultures in Mexico shared specific traits, like the use of the bow and arrow or wearing protective amulets, with cultures in Africa, Australia, and India. To solve this analytical problem, he proposed two hypotheses. The first was historical contact, meaning these groups somehow communicated. He rejected this as impossible given the vast geographical distances. By process of elimination, he arrived at his second hypothesis, parallel invention. Different peoples, independently and without contact, arrived at the exact same cultural solutions to the same human problems. He formalized this in his work, Research into the Early History of Mankind. Tylor's next major work, Primitive Culture, is considered one of the most foundational texts in the history of anthropology. Its timing was historically significant. It was published about 8 to 9 years after Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species. Darwin had introduced biological evolution, and the intellectual climate of the time was buzzing with ideas about development and progress. Tylor's Primitive Culture provided a parallel framework, but for cultural evolution. He argued that culture, just like biology, progresses through discernible evolutionary stages over time. One of Tylor's most enduring contributions appears in the early pages of Primitive Culture. It remains one of the most frequently cited definitions in the history of anthropology. He wrote, "Culture is a complex whole consisting of knowledge, belief, art, morals, laws, customs, and any other capabilities acquired by man as a member of society. Every single component of this definition deserves our careful attention to truly understand his theoretical framework. Let's start with the phrase complex whole. This asserts that culture is not just a random collection of isolated practices. It is an integrated system where everything functions together, through which these different religious groups negotiate coexistence. Without democracy, the system might fragment. Conversely, look at how religion shapes law. The Hindu reverence for the sacred cow finds direct legal expression in the directive principles of state policy in the Indian constitution, leading to specific state laws. This web of mutual dependencies is exactly what Tylor meant by a complex whole. The second major conceptual pillar is that culture is acquired by man as a member of society. This means culture is not genetic. It is not hardwired into our DNA. It is learned and transmitted socially from generation to generation. Because of this, culture is by definition a collective phenomenon. If a single individual engages in isolated antisocial behavior, that is individual deviance, not culture. But if an entire group shares a practice, like communal hunting, that is cultural. A quick mnemonic to remember the components of his definition is KBC, like the game show: knowledge, belief, and customs, which you can then expand to include morals, arts, and laws. Having defined culture, Tylor set out to reconstruct its history. He wanted to understand exactly how culture had developed over time. This presented a massive methodological challenge because physical artifacts and archaeological remains are simply insufficient to reconstruct the entirety of human cultural history. To bridge this gap, Tylor relied on two major methodological principles: uniformitarianism and the doctrine of survivals. The first principle, uniformitarianism, is actually a geological concept borrowed from Tylor's close friend Charles Lyell. Before Lyell, the prevailing belief was catastrophism, the idea that the Earth's topography was shaped by spectacular divine catastrophes, like massive floods. Lyell dismantled this by showing that the Earth is shaped by slow, gradual, continuous processes that operate the exact same way today as they did millions of years ago. For example, when tectonic plates collide, they form fold mountains like Mount Everest. This geological force produces the exact same result regardless of where on the planet it happens. Tylor took this geological principle and applied it to culture, creating the concept of the psychic unity of mankind. He argued that just as geological forces act uniformly across space and time, there are fundamental mental forces that operate uniformly across all human populations. Because all humans share the same basic cognitive and emotional constitution, they will independently arrive at the same solutions when faced with the same problems. For instance, people in ancient Egypt, tribal communities in modern Africa, and indigenous groups in northeastern India all independently developed the practice of wearing amulets to protect against illness and evil spirits. They faced the same existential fears, and, having the same mental framework, produced the same cultural response. The second principle Tylor used is the doctrine of survivals. A survival is essentially a cultural fossil. It is a practice, belief, or linguistic expression that a society continues to perform purely out of habit or tradition, even though it has completely lost its original meaning or functional relevance. Tylor noticed this when he saw shops in the US named Ye Old Coffee Parlor. In archaic English, the letter Y was used to represent the TH sound, so it was always meant to be pronounced the. The pronunciation evolved, but the spelling survived as a vestige of a dead linguistic system. Let's look at some fascinating everyday examples of survivals. Take the handshake. Today, it's just a greeting, but historically, displaying an open, weapon-free right hand was a vital safety signal to show peaceful intent to a potentially armed stranger. The danger is gone, but the reflex survives. Or consider Halloween. Ancestors of modern Europeans genuinely believed that on certain days, the boundary to the spirit world thinned. Dressing up and offering food was a serious religious ritual to placate malevolent spirits. Today, the sincere religious belief is gone, but the costuming and trick-or-treating survive by sheer force of cultural habit. Another survival is saying, "God bless you," after someone sneezes. Tylor traced this to an ancient belief that sneezing was a moment of spiritual danger, where the soul was momentarily expelled from the body. The blessing was a genuine protective invocation to keep evil spirits from entering the empty body. Today, we say it as a polite reflex, completely unaware of its spiritual logic. Similarly, the word lunatic comes from the Latin luna, meaning moon. It survives as a linguistic fossil of the medieval belief that the phases of the moon controlled human mental health. The English word spell is also a survival. It means both to arrange letters and to cast a magical curse. This dual meaning exists because of the ancient belief that certain spoken words carried inherent supernatural power to alter reality. Perhaps the most provocative example is the word ritual, which derives from the Sanskrit rituya, referring to the menstrual cycle. In early forager societies, menstruating women were isolated to prevent the scent of blood from attracting predators. Because human menstrual cycles often synchronized with the 28-day lunar cycle, this practical predator avoidance tactic gradually took on a sacred, mystical dimension, eventually giving rise to the broader concept of formal religious rituals. With his methods established, Tylor outlined his grand theory of cultural evolution, which rests on three foundational assertions. The first is one culture. Tylor argued that all of humanity shares a single, unified cultural trajectory. The differences we see between tribal societies and European societies are not differences of kind, but differences of stage. He likened it to a school curriculum. Imagine all of humanity is enrolled in the same school board. Some cultures are in class 1 and some are in class 10. They are on the exact same educational path. Some are just further along in the journey. The second assertion is one progression, meaning cultural development is strictly unilinear. It follows a single, fixed sequence of stages. There are no alternative routes, and no culture can skip a stage. Every society must move through three specific phases in exact order: savagery, which is the earliest and most primitive stage; barbarism, the intermediate stage; and finally, civilization, the most advanced stage. This three-stage framework was heavily influenced by earlier Enlightenment thinkers. The third assertion is one mind, which brings us back to the psychic unity of mankind. This is the engine that drives unilinear evolution. Because all human beings share the exact same fundamental mental constitution, cognitive capacities, and emotional responses, they will all inevitably arrive at the same solutions when faced with the same environmental challenges. This shared mental framework is why parallel invention happens, and it is why every culture is guaranteed to progress through the exact same evolutionary stages. Tylor wasn't just describing evolution. He offered a normative account of its purpose. He argued that cultural progress leads to higher organizational development, which produces three interconnected goods: power, happiness, and goodness. By power, he meant humanity's mastery over nature. Early humans were highly vulnerable. Think of how a human infant is completely helpless and dependent for over a decade, unlike a dog that can walk in days. A crying infant in a forest could attract predators and doom a whole group. Cultural progress, tools, fire, agriculture, was the mechanism through which humanity conquered these existential vulnerabilities. Beyond power, cultural progress also produces happiness and goodness. By happiness, Tylor meant the elimination of material suffering. You can think of this like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, moving from basic survival needs like food and shelter up to higher order needs like dignity and self-respect. By goodness, Tylor was drawing heavily on Enlightenment philosophers like Kant and Locke. He believed that as a culture progressed toward civilization, it would become increasingly governed by reason, which would inevitably result in a just, equitable society that protected the natural rights of all individuals. To operationalize this theory, Tylor needed a criterion to rank societies on his evolutionary scale. He chose the accumulation of knowledge about the natural sciences. Societies with the least knowledge of natural laws were ranked as savages, those with a medium level were barbarians, and those with the maximum scientific knowledge, which Tylor conveniently identified as European society, were at the stage of civilization. Tylor made a sweeping claim here. He declared that Western science was the only valid, true form of knowledge, and dismissed all indigenous, traditional, or non-Western knowledge systems as mere pre-scientific myths. Consistent with his view that culture is a human-made phenomenon, Tylor approached religion analytically rather than theologically. He defined religion simply and functionally as the belief in supernatural beings. By supernatural, he meant anything that operates outside the normal physical laws of nature. Because religion is a component of culture, and culture is man-made and evolves, Tylor reasoned that religion too must be a human invention with an evolutionary history. He set out to find the very first, most primitive form of religion and trace how it evolved into the complex monotheistic religions of his day. Tylor's account of the origin of religion begins with assumptions about the cognitive capacities of early humans. He argued that people at the earliest stage of cultural development lacked the capacity for abstract thinking. They couldn't group objects into categories. They couldn't conceptualize a herd of animals. Every single animal was experienced as a unique, irreducible entity. In this cognitive framework, dreams presented a massive puzzle. When an early human saw a dead relative or a distant tree in their sleep, they had no scientific or psychological tools to explain it. What was actually happening when these vivid images appeared in their minds? Tylor hypothesized that intellectually gifted individuals in these early societies, whom he called savage philosophers, developed an explanation. They proposed the theory of dual existence. They argued that every object has two distinct aspects, a physical, visible body that you can touch, and a psychic, invisible soul. Crucially, the soul is not permanently bound to the body. It can leave and travel independently. This perfectly explained dreams. When you see a dead relative in your sleep, their physical body may be gone, but their soul has traveled into your sleeping mind to visit you. This theory of dual existence led to a natural inference. If everything has a soul, then everything, even rocks, rivers, and mountains, is in some sense alive. This is the birth of animism, the belief that all of nature has a spirit. We can see living examples of animistic logic today. In certain northeastern Indian tribes, there is a practice of double funerals, where a body is preserved for 3 days just in case the wandering soul returns to revive it. Similarly, the Hindu practice of Shraddha involves offering food to crows, who are understood to be the returning souls of ancestors. Both practices treat the soul as an independent, persistent entity. Tylor traced the transition from animism to polytheism through the economic shift to agriculture. When society settled down to farm, their existential fears changed. They were no longer just worried about predators. Their survival now depended entirely on weather, rain, sun, and floods, which they could not control or predict. To manage this anxiety, they began to personify these natural forces. Rain wasn't just a meteorological event, it was a deity with emotions who could be flattered or angered. This multiplication of specialized deities, each controlling a domain of nature, is polytheism, representing a more complex religious system for a more complex society. The final stage in Tylor's religious evolution is monotheism. He argued this transition was driven by the accumulation of scientific knowledge. As humans learned more, they realized that rain, sun, and wind weren't isolated events controlled by separate gods, but parts of an interconnected system, like the water cycle. Think of the butterfly effect, where everything in the physical world is connected through chains of causation. As this holistic understanding grew, it became intellectually more compelling to believe in a single superintending intelligence that authored the entire unified system, rather than a committee of separate gods. This raises a logical question. If religion belongs to earlier, less developed stages of culture, why did it still exist in Tylor's civilized, scientific Europe? Tylor's answer was consistent with his broader theory. Religion in civilized society is itself a survival. Science had taken over the cognitive function of explaining how the world works. Religion no longer served its original explanatory purpose, but it persisted as a cultural habit, carried forward by tradition and emotional attachment, much like saying God bless you after a sneeze. Moving from religion, Tylor also devoted significant attention to the evolution of language. He started with the premise that language is a universal cultural trait, absolutely necessary for holding a society together. However, he noted reports from travelers describing societies with highly underdeveloped verbal vocabularies, where people relied primarily on gestures to communicate. This suggested to Tylor that gesture-based communication was historically prior to verbal language, meaning language too evolved from a primitive form to a sophisticated one. Tylor argued that human language originated from two primitive forms, gestures and interjections. Gestures are bodily movements and facial expressions. Even today, when you give someone directions, you naturally point your hands, a survival of this pre-linguistic mode. Interjections are spontaneous emotional sounds, like a cry of pain or a gasp of fear, which don't convey semantic information, but express raw feeling. Over time, as the vocal apparatus refined and abstract thinking developed, these primitive gestures and emotional sounds elaborated into the structured, grammatical languages we use today. Beyond origins, Tylor noted that language functions as a repository of cultural history through linguistic survivals. The words we use carry the embedded traces of ancient belief systems. We've discussed several of these. Saying God bless you, the magical connotations of the word spell, the lunar origins of lunatic and ritual, and the archaic spelling in ye olde. For an anthropologist, the language of a people is just as valuable for reconstructing the past as their physical artifacts, because it is littered with these historical fossils. The publication of Primitive Culture was an extraordinary intellectual event, perfectly timed alongside Darwin's work. Darwin explained biological evolution. Tylor explained cultural evolution. Max Muller's praise of anthropology as Tylor's science cemented his legacy. But the culminating biographical irony of Tylor's career involves Oxford University, the very institution that had categorically denied him admission as a young man because of his Quaker religion, later invited him back, not as a student, but as the founder and first head of their Department of Anthropology. While Tylor's framework is foundational, it has been extensively criticized and is largely rejected today. The most fundamental criticism is that it is deeply ethnocentric. Ethnocentrism is judging other cultures by the standards of your own. Tylor placed European civilization at the top because he used Western science as the only metric of progress. But consider a tribal person living in a deep forest. Their survival depends on an incredibly complex knowledge of plants, animal behavior, and seasonal cycles. A European scientist dropped in that forest would likely die in days. Judging the tribal culture as inferior because they lack trigonometry ignores the extraordinary competence of their own knowledge systems. The political consequences of Tylor's ethnocentric ranking were actively harmful on a global scale. By scientifically labeling non-European cultures as primitive or savage, his theory provided intellectual justification for colonialism and the white man's burden, the idea that Europeans had a duty to conquer and civilize the rest of the world. Even worse, it justified slavery. Enslaved Africans were packed into ships in spaces so small they couldn't sit up, and were sometimes thrown overboard to save wine cargo. This grotesque dehumanization was philosophically legitimized by evolutionary theories that classified them as less culturally developed and therefore less fully human. Furthermore, Tylor's assertion that cultural evolution inevitably produces greater happiness and goodness was devastated by history. The 20th century proved that scientific accumulation does not guarantee moral progress. The two world wars, fought by the very European nations Tylor placed at the apex of civilization, killed tens of millions of people. The pinnacle of scientific achievement produced atomic weapons capable of incinerating cities. Today, extreme wealth inequality and persistent global starvation prove that technological advancement does not automatically translate into justice or happiness for humanity. Another major flaw is Tylor's extension of the survivals concept to entire living societies. He implicitly treated contemporary tribal societies in Africa or the Americas as living fossils, windows into what Europeans looked like in the Stone Age. This is empirically false. It assumes these societies have remained completely static for thousands of years. In reality, all cultures constantly change, adapt, and invent. Assuming a modern tribal group is just a frozen snapshot of the past is incredibly condescending and denies them their own historical agency and creativity. Tylor's entire theoretical edifice rests on what became known pejoratively as armchair anthropology. He engaged in conjectural history, building grand theories based on speculation rather than systematic empirical field research. Tylor never actually traveled to live among the tribal peoples he was analyzing. Instead, he sat in his armchair in Britain and relied on travelogues and missionary reports. These texts were highly unreliable, often sensationalizing exotic rituals or cannibalism just to sell books to European audiences. He built a global theory of human development on a foundation of biased, secondhand accounts. Finally, Tylor's unilinear progressivism assumes that cultural change is always progressive, that societies only move forward and never regress. But the historical record is full of civilizational collapse. The Egyptian civilization declined, the Harappan or Indus Valley civilization achieved remarkable urban planning and sanitation, only to collapse around 1900 BCE, its achievements lost for centuries. Tylor's framework has absolutely no mechanism to explain cultural degeneration, making it unable to account for a massive portion of human history. Despite its profound flaws, Tylor's contribution was historically irreplaceable. He provided the first comprehensive framework for the comparative study of culture. By insisting that religion, language, and custom were human creations that could be studied scientifically, he established the intellectual project that defines anthropology to this day. Understanding Tylor is essential, not just for his own ideas, but because he set the baseline. The great anthropologists who followed him defined their own theories by reacting to, critiquing, and dismantling his classical evolutionism. Without knowing what they were reacting against, their own contributions cannot be properly understood, which perfectly sets the stage for the next phase of our journey. Picking right up with our review of E.B. Tylor, let's examine the concept of parallel invention. Imagine two parallel lines that never meet. Similarly, parallel invention occurs when two entirely separated human groups, who have never communicated, independently develop the exact same cultural solutions, like similar marriage systems or tools. For Tylor, this was empirical proof of the psychic unity of mankind, the theoretical proposition that all humans fundamentally think alike and will solve environmental challenges in the exact same way. However, Tylor's framework was deeply flawed by his own ethnocentrism. He placed 19th century Europe at the absolute top of his evolutionary hierarchy, viewing it as the pinnacle of civilization. When he compared tribes from Mexico and Africa, he equated their cultural development to second-grade students, while Europeans were likened to Harvard scholars. He kept his own European society as the ultimate reference point against which all other cultures were judged. This bias extended to gender as well. Tylor's famous definition of culture states it is acquired by man. This wasn't accidental. The sciences emerging from the Enlightenment were deeply patriarchal. The Enlightenment elevated reason over tradition, but culturally constructed reason as a male trait, while women were dismissed as purely emotional. This is why we hear of the founding fathers of disciplines, who were exclusively white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant males, but never any founding mothers. Another key concept of Tylor's is survivals, cultural practices that continue out of habit even after losing their original functional significance. While the concept itself is valid, Tylor and Victorian evolutionists applied it terribly. They looked at contemporary African societies and assumed they hadn't evolved at all. They treated these living, breathing communities as static, frozen relics of Europe's own prehistoric past. This assumption that any society can remain completely unchanging over thousands of years is intellectually unsound. To understand where Tylor got his ideas, we have to look at geology. He borrowed the concept of uniformitarianism, which argued that the Earth wasn't shaped by sudden catastrophes, but by slow, gradual processes like erosion that operate continuously and produce the same results everywhere. Tylor applied this to culture. He argued that cultural processes operate uniformly. Whenever any culture faces a specific challenge, the solution they devise will always be the same, reinforcing his belief in psychic unity. We can see parallel invention in several concrete examples. First, the striking similarities between ancient Greek and Indian mythologies, despite the geographic distance. Second, the global presence of a great flood narrative, like Noah's Ark in the biblical tradition, and almost identical story in Hindu tradition, as well as in Native American myths. Finally, Paleolithic stone tools found across Africa, Europe, and India share identical shapes and manufacturing techniques. They independently invented them without any contact. Let's ground the concept of ethnocentrism with a relatable example. Imagine a person from Delhi who is used to eating with cutlery, traveling to South India and judging people for eating meals from a banana leaf with their hands. That judgment is ethnocentric, evaluating a perfectly valid cultural practice through the narrow lens of one's own norms. Tylor did exactly this, using his Victorian Catholic Christian standards to measure and rank the entire world. This brings us to a major criticism of Tylor's work. If the psychic unity of mankind is true and people everywhere fundamentally think alike, how do we explain the enormous variations between cultures? If our minds are identical in their problem-solving, why does the world look so diverse? This is a crucial analytical point to remember as we evaluate classical evolutionism. Now, let's cross the Atlantic and meet Lewis Henry Morgan, widely considered the father of American anthropology. While Tylor was developing classical evolutionism in Britain, Morgan took these ideas and applied them to the American context. Born into a wealthy family and trained as a lawyer, Morgan's path into anthropology was actually sparked by an 1842 economic depression that left him professionally idle. To pass the time, Morgan formed a club called the Order of the Gordian Knot to study and compare Greek mythologies with other global legends. Later, this club was redesigned into the Grand Order of the Iroquois. The Iroquois were a confederacy of Native American tribes in the Northeast. The club shifted its focus to discussing the unique cultural practices, religions, and customs of these indigenous communities living in autonomous reserve areas. Morgan's real breakthrough happened through his friend Ely Parker, a member of the Seneca tribe. Parker came to the club not to share myths, but to ask for legal help against land companies encroaching on Iroquois territory. Morgan, a lawyer, agreed to represent them in federal court. In exchange, Parker helped Morgan study the tribe, acting as a translator. This collaboration resulted in one of the first scientific field exercises in anthropology, culminating in Morgan's book, League of the Iroquois. During this fieldwork, Morgan discovered something peculiar about how the Iroquois named their relatives. He distinguished between lineal kin, direct ancestors like your father, and lateral kin, sideward branches like your uncle. The Iroquois called both their father and their father's brother by the exact same name. Similarly, a mother and her sister shared the same title. They didn't distinguish between lineal and lateral relatives. Realizing this wasn't just an isolated Iroquois quirk, Morgan launched a massive global study. He sent a 200-question survey to diplomats and missionaries worldwide to collect kinship terminologies. He compiled the responses into a monumental book titled Systems of Consanguinity and Affinity of the Human Family. To clarify, consanguinity refers to blood relatives, while affinity refers to relationships created by law or love, such as marriage. Morgan concluded that global kinship systems fall into two types. The first is classificatory terminology. This is where a group of relatives is clubbed together under the same name, like calling both your father and your uncle father. Morgan identified three subtypes: Malayan, used in Oceania, Turanian, found in East Asian societies, and Ganawanian, associated with Native American peoples. The second type is descriptive terminology. Here, lineal and lateral relatives are carefully distinguished. Your father has one specific title, and your uncle has a completely different one. Every category has a unique label. Morgan also divided this into three subtypes: Semitic, for Hebrew-speaking peoples, Aryan, specifically for Sanskrit-speaking populations in India, and Euralian, referring to Europeans. Inspired by a Sanskrit scholar, Morgan realized that kinship terminology isn't just about names. It's a linguistic fossil that reflects past social behavior. While society changes, words remain static. Morgan controversially argued that classificatory terminology reflected an uncivilized past of promiscuous group marriage, where parentage was indeterminate, hence calling all men of a certain age father. Conversely, he viewed descriptive terminology as the mark of a civilized society with monogamy and clear parentage. Let's look at a fascinating example of this linguistic fossilization. In Hindi, the word for a husband's younger brother is devar. Etymologically, dvi means second and var means husband, literally the second husband. In ancient times, due to high male mortality in warfare, a widow would often marry her younger brother-in-law to protect family property. Today, that practice is largely gone, but the word devar remains in daily use, preserving the memory of past social behavior. Morgan proposed two reasons why societies shift from classificationary to descriptive terminology. The primary reason is the rise of private property. Hunter-gatherers had no surplus, so inheritance didn't matter. But with the invention of agriculture, people began accumulating surplus wealth. Suddenly, a father needed to know exactly who his biological children were so he could pass on his property. This demand for clear parentage drove the creation of descriptive terminology. The second, more speculative reason involves the origin of the family. Morgan hypothesized that in early communal marriage systems, men had to collectively defend their group's women and children from outside attacks. Through this process of defense, men gradually developed specific emotional attachments and a sense of proprietarial responsibility over specific children. This growing consciousness of "these are my children" created the social incentive for precise descriptive kinship labels. All of these ideas culminated in Morgan's magnum opus, Ancient Society. He argued that human history is a progressive ascent up a ladder, driven by the accumulation of practical experimental knowledge. He ranked societies based on four criteria: their idea of government, family, and property, but most importantly, their inventions and discoveries. Technology was his primary criterion because it provides an undeniable, objective chronological sequence, like how the wheel definitively came before the steam engine. Using technology as the benchmark, Morgan divided human evolution into 7 stages. Stage 1 is lower savagery, marked by the development of speech, with pure hand-to-mouth survival. Stage 2, middle savagery, is defined by fishing and the control of fire. Stage 3, upper savagery, is characterized by the invention of the bow and arrow, allowing for more advanced hunting. The ascent continues into barbarism. Stage 4, lower barbarism, begins with pottery. Stage 5, middle barbarism, is marked by animal domestication and sedentary life. Stage 6, Upper Barbarism, features the smelting of iron. Finally, Stage 7 is civilization, defined by the invention of writing to transmit knowledge and standardized weights and measures, which indicate complex trade and commerce. Morgan argued that technology drives evolution because it gives humanity control over subsistence. When you aren't worried about your next meal, you can make 20-year career plans and focus on intellectual advancement. However, this contains a deep materialist assumption. Think of the parable of the capitalist who tells a fisherman to build a massive fleet just so he can eventually retire and fish on the beach. Morgan assumed all humans naturally desire to accumulate surplus, ignoring that some cultures intentionally choose sustainable, non-accumulative ways of life. Moving to political organization, which takes up over half of ancient society, Morgan identifies a massive shift from societas to civitas. Societas is governance based purely on personal kinship relationships, like an extended family making decisions together. But as populations grow, this becomes impossible. Society transitions to civitas, where governance is based on the law of the land. In civitas, like in modern nations, the law applies to everyone within the territory equally, regardless of blood ties. Morgan mapped this transition through specific stages. It starts with the promiscuous horde, an egalitarian, undifferentiated group with no leaders. As families form, we get gentes, groups tracing lineage to a known ancestor. As populations multiply, we get clans, or gotras, tracing descent to a legendary assumed ancestor. Next is the tribe, united by shared language and customs, often managing communal resources. Finally, we reach the nation, or state, featuring formal written laws, standing armies, and bureaucracies, the ultimate realization of civitas. Morgan also tracked how we trace our ancestry, known as descent systems. In the earliest stage of promiscuity, there was no recognized descent. The first formal system to emerge was matrilineal descent, traced through the mother. Why? First, maternity is always certain, whereas early paternity was not. Second, as gatherers, women likely discovered agriculture. Because they controlled the first agricultural surplus, the first lines of inheritance naturally ran from mothers to their children. But as agriculture became more intensive, requiring heavy muscular labor like plowing, control of the surplus shifted to men. Men now needed to pass wealth to their biological children, driving the shift to patrilineal descent. Morgan even predicted our modern future, bilineal descent. In modern economies, both mothers and fathers work, own property, and want to pass it on. Consequently, modern societies increasingly recognize and value both maternal and paternal lineages equally. Finally, Morgan looked at burial practices. Early humans buried a person's few tools with them because there was no inheritance system. But as surplus grew, society demanded that wealth be passed to direct descendants, creating formal private property. This perfectly illustrates Tylor's definition of culture as a complex whole. A single economic shift, the creation of surplus, triggers a domino effect, completely transforming kinship, government, descent, and marriage. We will see how to structure these interconnected ideas in our answer writing methodology next. Picking right up from Morgan's ideas on technology and government, we now turn to the third major criterion in his evolutionary scheme, the family. Morgan argued in ancient society that the family, just like every other aspect of culture, is subject to evolutionary change. He believed that the stage of family evolution in any given society is directly tied to its material conditions, most importantly, the rise of private property. As private property emerges and grows more complex, the family structure changes to accommodate new social needs. While Morgan identified 15 distinct stages of family evolution, he considered 5 of these to be the hallmark stages found in virtually all societies. Let's examine these 5 stages in detail. The first and most primitive stage in Morgan's framework is the consanguineous stage. The word consanguineous simply means of the same blood. In this initial stage, there is absolutely no incest taboo. To be precise, incest refers to a sexual relationship with a blood relative, and an incest taboo refers to the cultural rules forbidding such unions. In the consanguineous stage, sexual unions between blood relatives were completely unrestricted. The only bond keeping the group together was their shared origin. Morgan associated this stage with lower savagery, the most primitive phase of human cultural evolution, describing the conditions similar to animals, who also lack kinship categories that prohibit mating. It is worth noting that while the consanguineous stage lacked it, every known human society today has some form of incest taboo. However, exactly which relationships are considered incestuous varies wildly across cultures. For example, in North Indian Hindu tradition, the rule of 4 gotras strictly prohibits marrying anyone sharing a common ancestor within 5 generations on either the mother's or father's side. But in South Indian Hindu communities, cousin marriages and even uncle-niece marriages are common and acceptable. Similarly, in Muslim communities, parallel cousin marriages, like the children of 2 brothers, are permitted. Despite this cultural variability, the universal element found in every society without exception is the prohibition on parent-child and sibling sexual relations. In Morgan's first stage, however, even these universal taboos did not yet exist. Moving to the second stage, we find the Punaluan family. This represents a significant moral advance because the incest taboo begins to develop, specifically the prohibition on sexual relations between brothers and sisters. However, group marriage persists. In the Punaluan stage, a group of brothers collectively marries a group of sisters. If there are 5 brothers, they collectively marry 5 sisters, and any of the men can mate with any of the women. There is no pairing off into exclusive couples. Sexuality remains communal within the bounds of the 2 groups. The crucial change in the Punaluan stage is that sexual unions are now exogamous at the sibling level. Brothers and sisters no longer mate with each other. Marriage happens between 2 different groups. Morgan points out that this stage laid the foundation of exogamy. The term comes from the Greek roots exo, meaning outside, and gamy, meaning marriage, the practice of finding a partner outside one's own social group. Contemporary practices like Gotra exogamy or village exogamy trace their origins, in Morgan's framework, back to this Punaluan stage, which he associated with the periods of Middle and Upper Savagery. The third stage is the Syndesmian family. This marks the beginning of a transition away from group marriage toward individualized pairing, though the transition is incomplete. Here, one man legally or formally marries one woman, creating an arrangement that superficially looks like an exclusive couple. However, the underlying sexual morality of group marriage has not fully disappeared. The marriage bond creates a legal pairing, but not sexual exclusivity. Either partner may still mate with people outside the marriage. Furthermore, the marriage bond in this stage is very fragile and easily dissolved. It is not a permanent, lifelong institution. The most important practical implication of the Syndesmian family relates to biological fatherhood. Even though a woman is legally married to a specific man, if she gives birth, that child is legally considered the child of the married couple, regardless of who the biological father actually is. The biological concept of fatherhood, the idea that a specific man's sperm produced a specific child, simply does not exist yet as a socially recognized category. Legal pairing determines parentage, not biology. Morgan associated the stage with all 3 phases of barbarism. The fourth stage is the polygynous or patriarchal family. This stage emerges when economic control falls decisively into men. As agriculture intensifies and generates surplus, men become the owners of private property. This ownership creates a new, urgent social need. Men need to know with certainty who their legitimate heirs are so they can transmit their accumulated wealth to the next generation. The resolution to this need comes in the form of polygyny, one man having multiple wives at the same time. The economic logic behind polygyny is fascinating. Before mechanized equipment, the primary determinant of agricultural output was human manpower. The equation was simple. More manpower equals more tillage, which equals more crops, more wealth, and ultimately more power for the family. Polygyny directly addresses this manpower problem. A man with multiple wives can produce more children, providing a larger labor force for the fields. Women also had incentives to participate, as belonging to a large, wealthy family provided security and stability. Morgan associates this stage with the beginning of civilization, defined as the point when humans could produce genuine surplus wealth. We can also view polygyny through the lens of evolutionary biology. A man's reproductive success is maximized by having many children, as he is not biologically constrained by pregnancy. A woman, however, invests heavily in a single pregnancy and seeks a partner who can provide and protect. In a society with unequal resource distribution, women will rationally prefer a resource-wealthy man, even if it means sharing him, because the material security outweighs the disadvantage. Furthermore, interviews in African polygynous societies reveal that women sometimes prefer this arrangement because the domestic burden is distributed among co-wives, allowing for shared childcare and personal time. The fifth and final stage in Morgan's scheme is the monogamous family, defined as the exclusive union of one man with one woman, with mutually exclusive sexual rights. In this system, parentage is biologically clear. Because women are sexually exclusive to one man, every child born can be definitively identified as the child of that specific man, making the line of inheritance completely unambiguous. This form of family is associated with the rise of property rights and was prevalent in the later stages of civilization. Morgan connects monogamy explicitly to the question of descent. He predicted that as societies modernize and both men and women become equal economic contributors, descent will shift from patrilineal to bilineal, tracking ancestry from both parents equally. Morgan also attached a moral evaluation to monogamy, stating it is morally correct because it recognizes both man and woman as equal building blocks of the family, unlike previous stages that treated women merely as instruments of reproduction. However, we must be careful here. Morality is subjective and dynamic. Judging monogamy as inherently superior is a form of ethnocentrism. As we saw with polygyny, moral judgments about marriage forms cannot be separated from the social and material conditions in which they operate. Let's consolidate these 5 stages. First, the consanguous family, characterized by incestuous group marriage with no incest taboos, existing during lower savagery. Second, the Punaluan family. Group marriage remains, but brothers and sisters no longer marry, laying the foundation for exogamy during middle and upper savagery. Third, the Sindislian family, a transition towards stable pair bonding, where one man formally marries one woman, but without exclusive sexual access, prevalent during all stages of barbarism. Continuing the summary, fourth, the polygynous or patriarchal family, associated with the rise of male economic dominance and private property in early civilization, where a man could have multiple wives to increase manpower. Finally, the monogamous family, representing the most advanced stage. It establishes an exclusive, lifelong pair bond, ensuring clear lines of inheritance, and is prevalent in the later stages of civilization. Stepping back from the specific stages, we can see the underlying theoretical logic running through Morgan's framework. Everything is ultimately driven by changes in material conditions, primarily the rise and growing complexity of private property. As material conditions change, family structures, descent practices, and marriage systems follow suit. This parallels Tylor's observation that shifting from foraging to agriculture changes religion. The underlying causal driver is always the transformation of the material basis of society. This materialist engine establishes Morgan as an important precursor to the Marxist anthropological tradition. Now, let's turn to the criticisms of Morgan. Many of the critiques leveled against E.B. Tylor apply equally to Morgan. First is ethnocentrism. Morgan ranked all societies from the perspective of his own culture, placing European American civilization at the pinnacle. Second is racism. He considered the white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant male as the most evolved, viewing non-white peoples as inferior. Third is his armchair methodology. Aside from brief work with the Iroquois, Morgan relied entirely on unvalidated secondary sources like missionary accounts, never traveling to the regions he classified. Finally, like Tylor, Morgan believed in unilinear, progressive evolution, failing to recognize that cultures can regress or degenerate, as seen in the decline of the Roman or Mayan empires. A criticism specific to Morgan reveals the deep racial ideology embedded in his work, stemming from the influence of Samuel G. Morton. Morton was a 19th-century medical doctor who developed a pseudo-scientific theory based on measuring human skulls. He claimed that different racial groups have different average brain sizes, and that brain size correlates directly with intelligence. Morton explicitly argued that white Europeans had larger brains and were therefore more intelligent, while Africans and other non-white groups had smaller brains and inferior capacity for civilization. Morgan was deeply influenced by Morton and incorporated these racist claims into his evolutionary framework. For Morgan, the reason white European culture had reached the highest stage of civilization wasn't due to historical circumstance or geography, it was biology. He believed their supposedly larger brains allowed them to invent and evolve further. This is a foundational moment of scientific racism, using pseudo-scientific biology to justify colonial domination. The residue of this thinking persists today in subtle stereotypes, like the assumption that every Indian is a tech guy, an intellectual descendant of the racialized categorizations promoted by Morton and Morgan. Another major critique comes from Meyer Fortes, who argued that Morgan's framework is hopelessly parochial. Fortes observed that when Morgan was writing in the 1870s, American society was undergoing rapid industrialization. This shift was breaking down extended families into nuclear ones, consolidating male economic authority in factories, and intensifying patrilineal inheritance. Fortes points out that Morgan simply took these specific trends of 19th century American capitalism and projected them onto the whole of human history, mistaking a local, historically specific trajectory for a universal law of cultural evolution. To illustrate Fortes' point that different material and demographic conditions produce different family forms, consider two examples. First, Islamic polygyny. In a historical context of intense warfare and high male mortality, polygyny served a social welfare function, ensuring widows and orphans were provided for. Second, consider polyandry in certain villages of Harania. Due to female infanticide, there is a severe shortage of women, leading to informal arrangements where brothers share a single wife. In both cases, the driving force is demographics, a shortage of men or a shortage of women, not the accumulation of private property that Morgan emphasized. There is no single universal trajectory. Morgan's specific claim that matrilineal descent, tracing ancestry through the mother, was the earliest historical form generated intense debate. John Lubbock offered a position of qualified skepticism. Logically, Lubbock agreed with Morgan. In conditions of uncertain paternity, matrilineal descent makes perfect sense, because the mother is always identifiable. However, Lubbock withheld full support due to a lack of evidence. When looking at contemporary tribal societies, which evolutionists viewed as windows into the past, matrilineal descent and female authority were almost non-existent, making Lubbock doubt such a stage ever actually occurred. Henry Maine's critique was far more severe. He outright rejected Morgan's hypothesis. Maine looked to Roman civilization, which he considered the best documented ancient society, and found absolutely no period of matrilineal dominance. Rome was always patriarchal. From this, Maine developed the concept of patria potestas, the power of the father. He argued that patriarchal power was not a late development, but the original and universal condition of human social organization from the very beginning, dismissing Morgan's matrilineal stage as an unsubstantiated fantasy. The third critique comes from a scholar noted as Ferguson, described as Morgan's arch-rival. Ferguson accepted that matrilineal descent came first, but proposed an entirely different reason for it. He argued that in early societies, chronic food scarcity meant women, limited by physical constraints like menstruation, were seen as a liability in hunting and gathering. This perceived burden led to widespread female infanticide. The resulting demographic imbalance, a severe shortage of women, forced society to adopt polyandry, where several men shared one wife. In this polyandrous system, determining paternity is impossible, which is why, according to Ferguson, matrilineal descent emerged. But how did society move to patrilineal descent? Ferguson points to bride capture. Men, frustrated by having to share wives, resorted to violently attacking other groups to steal their women. This violent bride capture became the original form of exogamy. Over time, it formalized into peaceful women exchange, though survivals of this violence persist in mock capture rituals in modern weddings and in the brutal historical reality of pre-modern warfare, where women were treated as the primary prize or booty for invading armies. We will explore more of these historical dynamics as we move forward. We turn our attention now to James George Frazer, the third major figure in classical evolutionism. Frazer was a hardcore follower of E.B. Tylor, but his academic roots were quite different. He was trained as a literary scholar in English literature, not as a social scientist. This literary background profoundly shaped his anthropological writing. The story goes that Frazer fell ill one day, and to pass the time, he picked up Tylor's book, Primitive Culture. Reading it, Frazer was struck by Tylor's concept of the psychic unity of mankind. Because Frazer had read widely in European mythological traditions, he immediately recognized that many of the myths he studied shared similar structures and themes, despite originating in different times and places. Frazer's signature intellectual move was to bring the tools of literary comparison to anthropological data. He wanted to systematically identify cross-cultural parallels in mythology. He began with two specific narratives. The first is the Nemi myth, a story common in the Mediterranean region of southern Europe. It centers on a king of the forest who has a slave named Nini. The slave breaks a branch from a sacred tree, uses it to kill the king, and takes the throne. But having won the crown this way, the new king lives in perpetual dread, constantly watching that sacred tree, knowing that someday someone else will use a branch from it to kill him. The second story Frazer focused on comes from Norse mythology, the story of Balder the Beautiful. Balder was so beloved that the goddess Frigg traveled the world, extracting an oath from every object, animal, and element that they would never harm him. But she missed one tiny thing, a branch of mistletoe. Knowing Balder was invincible, the gods played a game of throwing objects at him. Loki, the trickster god, discovered the mistletoe oversight. He handed the mistletoe branch to a blind god, guided his hand, and had him throw it at Balder. Because the mistletoe had not taken the oath, it struck and killed him. Frazer drew an explicit parallel between these two stories. In the Nemi myth, a sleeve uses a tree branch to kill a king. In the Norse myth, a mistletoe branch kills a divine god. Two entirely different cultural traditions, separated by geography and centuries, converged on the exact same narrative motif. Frazer saw this as undeniable evidence of Tylor's psychic unity of mankind. He used this parallel as the organizing motif for his magnum opus, titled The Golden Bough, referencing that mythological sacred branch. This was a massive undertaking. The book spans 12 volumes, which, if stacked together, would reach the height of an average person. In The Golden Bough, Frazer systematically documented mythological traditions from across the world to demonstrate their structural similarities. For instance, he looked at the Noah's flood narrative in the Bible, a great flood, a chosen survivor, a boat, and the rebuilding of civilization. He noted a near-identical parallel in Hindu mythology with the story of Varaha, the third avatar of Vishnu, who rescues the earth from underwater. Similar flood myths appear in Native American traditions. While modern internet channels might claim this proves ancient contact between these civilizations, anthropologists like Frazer interpreted these parallels as evidence of psychic unity. The same fundamental human concerns produce similar narrative responses everywhere. The most significant theoretical contribution of The Golden Bough is Frazer's argument about the evolution of human thought. He proposed that the human psyche, the fundamental way we understand and relate to the world, has evolved through three sequential stages: magic, religion, and science. According to Frazer, each of these stages corresponds to a stage of cultural evolution. The way people think determines the kind of culture they produce, and as the dominant mode of thinking changes, the culture changes with it. The first and most primitive stage is magic. In this stage, people believe the universe is governed by universal, impersonal laws of cause and effect. Crucially, they believe that by manipulating these laws, a magician can command nature. Frazer identified two major types of magic. The first is homeopathic magic, based on the law that like produces like. Think of a voodoo doll, where harming the doll harms the person, or rolling stones down a hill to mimic thunder, hoping to produce actual rain. The second type is contagious magic, based on the law that once in contact, always in contact. This involves using an object that was once close to a person, like a strand of hair or a fingernail clipping, to cast a spell on them. You might think magic is entirely a thing of the past, but Frazer's concepts are still visible today. Consider a common instruction parents give students moving into a hostel: wash your own undergarments. This isn't just about hygiene. Deeply embedded in cultural memory is the fear of contagious magic, the belief that bodily fluids left on clothing could be used by someone with malicious intent to cast a spell on you. Or consider walking down the street and seeing a lemon strung with chilies on the ground. Even a staunch rationalist will likely step around it, feeling a flash of discomfort. That hesitation is a survival of magical thinking. Frazer argues that over time, magical practices began to fail. Magicians promised rain or victory in battle, and when they couldn't deliver, the authority of magic was undermined. This failure pushed humanity into the second stage, religion. In the religious stage, people no longer believe they can command nature. Instead, they believe natural forces are controlled by supernatural beings, gods and spirits, that are fundamentally beyond human control. The relationship shifts entirely. Humans must now please these powers through prayers and sacrifices. The attitude changes from confident command to humble submissiveness. As human knowledge continued to develop, a third shift occurred: the transition from religion to science. In the scientific stage, humans explain natural phenomena through rational investigation and empirical observation. Lightning is no longer seen as the wrath of a god. It is understood as an electrical discharge. Disease is not divine punishment, but the result of pathogens or genetics. In this stage, the human psyche is oriented towards understanding rather than appeasing, focusing on rationality, discoveries, and inventions to explain the natural world. An important nuance to Frazer's framework is that he didn't believe the progression ended with the science of his day. He saw science as an ever-evolving framework. Just as Newtonian physics was superseded by Einstein's relativity, which is now being extended by quantum and string theory, future science will supersede our current understanding. Frazer even held a deeply personal aspiration that science and religion might eventually converge. He thought that a sufficiently advanced understanding of reality might show they address the same underlying truths. For example, the unbroken causal chain of the Big Bang resonates strongly with Hindu philosophical ideas about karma and predetermined fate. Beyond the Golden Bough, Frazer wrote a highly influential article on totemism. The term totem comes from the Ojibwa word ototamen, meaning one's kin or brother. When we add ism, it denotes a belief system. Totemism, as defined by Frazer, is the belief held by a group that they share a mystical, spiritual relationship with a particular animal or plant, their totem. The community treats this totem as their assumed ancestor, believing their ultimate origin traces back to it. Because of this sacred kinship, killing, consuming, or disrespecting the totem animal or plant is strictly forbidden. To really grasp totemism, we can look at a direct structural parallel, the Gotra system in Hinduism. In the Gotra system, a group of people traces its descent from an assumed ancestor, specifically a mythical or semi-mythical sage, a rishi. People sharing a Gotra consider themselves blood relatives. In totemism, the assumed ancestor is simply an animal or plant rather than a human sage. The structural logic is identical in both systems. Invoking an assumed common ancestor creates a powerful sense of shared identity and blood relationship among all the members of the group. So, how did totemism originate? Frazer argued it grew out of an antecedent belief in the soul. He drew on ethnographic accounts of the Arunta tribes of Australia. The Arunta believed that when a person dies, their soul doesn't vanish, it migrates into a specific animal in their environment. Over time, as more community members died, these animals came to be seen as the living vessels of the ancestors' souls. If your grandfather's soul lives in a rabbit, you don't kill or eat the rabbit. Eventually, the entire community began to trace its collective origin to these sacred animals, giving birth to totemism. Frazer provided another striking piece of evidence from the Arunta regarding reproduction. When an Arunta woman wanted to conceive, she would pray and make offerings to the totem. In a society where the biological mechanics of fertilization were unknown and the connection between intercourse and a pregnancy 9 months later wasn't clear, the explanation had to come from elsewhere. If a woman prayed to the totem and became pregnant, the logical conclusion was that the totem caused the pregnancy. Therefore, the totem was the ultimate generative force, making every child born in the community a direct descendant of that totem. This brings us to Frazer's brilliant logical connection between totemism and the origin of exogamy. If every person in the community is a child of the totem, then they all share the totem as a common ancestor. That makes everyone in the group blood relatives. Because of the universal incest taboo, sexual unions between blood relatives are forbidden. Therefore, members of the same totem group cannot marry each other. They are forced to find spouses from a different totem group. This practice of marrying outside one's own group is exogamy, and Frazer argued it was born directly from totemic beliefs. Despite his massive contributions, Frazer faced severe criticism. The most common critique is that his work reads more like literary storytelling than rigorous anthropological analysis. Because of his English literature background, he collected myths and presented them beautifully, but stripped of their actual anthropological context. In fact, calling someone the Frazer of anthropology became slang for a writer who produces impressive narratives with very little scientific rigor. Furthermore, Frazer shared the flaws of Tylor and Morgan. He was a unilinear evolutionist, an armchair anthropologist who never did fieldwork, and his ranking of European society at the top made his theories deeply ethnocentric. The most substantive theoretical criticism of Frazer is his assumption that magic, religion, and science are sequential stages that replace one another. Empirical observation shows they actually coexist simultaneously. Take a modern Indian family buying a new luxury car. The car itself is a product of advanced science and engineering. On the bonnet, they draw a swastika, a religious symbol invoking divine blessing, and from the rearview mirror, they hang a lemon and chili string to ward off the evil eye, a clear practice of contagious magic. Science, religion, and magic are all present and active in the exact same event. Furthermore, Frazer's model assumes that moving from magic to science constitutes unambiguous progress. But what does better actually mean? A scientific study measuring dopamine, the chemical associated with happiness, found that tribal populations actually had significantly higher levels than people in technologically advanced urban centers. Think of the capitalist working their whole life just to retire and fish, while the tribal fisherman is already doing it. The scientific revolution gave us medicine, yes, but it also gave us atomic bombs, environmental destruction, and global warfare. The idea that progress is uniformly beneficial is deeply subjective, undermining Frazer's confident evolutionary ranking. Frazer also treated contemporary religion as a mere survival, a cultural fossil that persists out of habit but has no real function in the modern scientific world. This is empirically inaccurate. If religion is just a fossil, how do we explain the Sunni-Shia sectarian conflicts shaping the geopolitics of the Middle East? How do we explain the role of religious identity in the India-Pakistan partition, or the enormous moral and political authority wielded by the Pope on the world stage today? Religion is not a passive survival. It is an active, living force that fulfills real human needs and drives global social organization. We conclude our discussion of Frazer and of classical evolutionism as a whole with a remarkable piece of self-awareness. Frazer candidly admitted in an interview that his theories were built on indirect data from missionaries and travelers. He actually predicted that once rigorous first-hand ethnographic fieldwork began, his theories would be rejected and placed in the Museum of Anthropology as historical artifacts. He was right. In the 20th century, immersive fieldwork by anthropologists like Malinowski fundamentally contradicted these armchair theories. Yet, Frazer's legacy remains significant. At a time when no one else was doing it, he assembled an extraordinary body of comparative data, forcing the world to recognize cross-cultural patterns that demanded explanation.